Back in 1940, it was real difficult to find a job, to earn any money at all, to continue schooling. So I elected to join the armed forces. They had a good education program, and I figured I could continue my education. As it turned out, I had more of an education than I planned on. I joined the Army Air Corps in August of 1940 and was sent down to San Francisco Bay area to a fighter squadron. We took our basic training, and then I was sent back to St. Louis, Missouri to a communication school to learn all about radio repair and operation. Upon graduating in October of 1940, I went back to San Francisco to find our unit had taken their airplanes apart, and they had them all crated and everything all packed up, ready to load onto big ships in San Francisco Bay to go somewhere. They didn't give us any name. The code name was Plum. We loaded all of our equipment in San Francisco, and we left there, headed west out in the Pacific Ocean. We traveled for about 3 days, came to the Hawaiian Islands. We stopped in Pearl Harbor on the 6th of November of 1941. This was just exactly 1 month before Pearl Harbor. We picked up a naval escort from Pearl Harbor, and from there we proceeded on across the Pacific. We came over past south of Midway to Wake, and we came into Guam. One of our transports had engine troubles. We had to go into port and get that ship repaired. We spent 1 day in Guam. We proceeded on west. Now, being a radio operator, we had to learn Morse code. We also had to learn by signal lights, and at night time on board the ships we could watch these other ships sending messages with the blinkers, these big lights, and we could read their messages, and we immediately knew where we were heading. About halfway between Guam and the Philippines, we encountered a Japanese fishing boat. It was nothing but just a radio station reporting the movement of all ships. Within a matter of just a few seconds, these two big cruisers that we had sank that Japanese boat. And this was 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor. We continued on through the San Fernando Straits and ended up at Manila Harbor. We landed there on Thanksgiving Day, 1941, 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor. We spent these 2 weeks unloading ships, all of our equipment, and taking them out to the southeast of the city of Manila to an air base called Nichols Field. This one field was the main fighter base in the Philippines. They had 4 squadrons of fighter airplanes there. We spent the 2 weeks putting our airplanes together, and the day that we landed, we found out there was going to be a war. It was just a matter of when it was going to start, because the Japanese had already deployed all their forces, and that all in this area, almost in this area, clear down to here, before they ever hit Pearl Harbor. They had troops placed ready to just land on the islands. before they hit Pearl Harbor. We knew there was a war coming. I don't know why they didn't know back here, because 2 days after we landed there, I went on an observation flight up over Lingayen Gulf. This where this green arrow is right here. And there sat 80 great big Japanese transports, less than 200 and 300 yards from the shore. They dropped anchors. They had great big landing barges about half the size of this theater. They had all their equipment loaded on these barges, and all they had to do was just pull them to shore, and they were landing. After we got our airplanes put together, we put all the machine guns, including the ammunition, and all the bombs and that on our airplanes, and our crews lived on the runways underneath these airplanes 24 hours a day. And then finally we got word from Washington. They made us take all the ammunition, all the bombs off of our airplanes. We had everything all completed and ready to fight, and they let all the troops go for one day. We got to go into Manila. We went in and went all around Quezon City, toward the whole city. In the evening, we went to the theater to see a show with Dorothy Lamar and Bob Hope, Alone of the South Seas. And during the show, they immediately cut the show off and announced that all military personnel report to their bases immediately. The Japanese had taken off from Formosa, or Taiwan. They had already taken off in their big bombers and were headed towards the Philippines. That was 9 o'clock at night. So we went out to Nichols Field about 5 miles, and we started arming our airplanes with ammunition and bombs again. Our radio station we had, it was a mobile radio station, one of these great big 8-wheeler trucks and a trailer, and we had it set up right on the edge of the golf course next to the runway. And being a radio operator, I had to take my turn of 3 hours on the radio, taking messages, sending and receiving. I went on shift at midnight, and I took messages. They didn't have time to code them or anything. They just come in straight text. And we knew every movement the Japanese were making. We knew where these airplanes were all the time. At 3 o'clock, we changed operators on the station. And I just took a blanket and jumped outside the truck, lay down on the grass, and I was so tired that I fell asleep immediately. And at 12 minutes after 3, the first flight of bombers came over. There were only 45, these big twin-engine bombers. They come over and they drop their load of bombs, and they hit about every vital part of the base. The ammunition storage, the water supply. The other flight of bombers took the port area where all the docks and the ships were tied up. They made a perfect hit on that too. They destroyed all the docks, which contained all of our military supplies, plus all the food for all the military in the Philippine Islands. We had 38,000 Americans in the Philippine Islands when the war broke out. This, when they hit us, was exactly the same time that they hit Pearl Harbor, way over here. exactly the same time. They hit Midway, they hit Wake, they hit Guam. Everywhere they were at, they hit at the same time. They had it well planned, well organized, and they just about caught everybody by surprise. They really done a lot of damage. On our air base, they had these airplanes lined up in 3 big long rows, about a half mile long, from wingtip to wingtip. When they got through, there was practically nothing left. My organization, we took our airplanes, we only had 25 P-40 aircraft. We'd taken ours when we went back at 9 o'clock that night, and we pulled them all out and took them over around on the golf course under these big trees and halfway hid our airplanes, and we didn't lose any. So it was lucky we ended up with a few airplanes left. The other fighter outfits had moved from Nichols Field, and they went up into the central part of Luzon, closer to Lingayen Gulf, and one had went straight to the west and was over on a little peninsula called Eva. They hit all these other bases. Our big bomber base at Clark Field, which was about 100 miles north of Manila, the Japanese hit that the same way. And our big B-17 bombers, big 4-engine bombers and that, hundreds of them were just destroyed in a matter of minutes. They only had maybe 4 or 5 big bombers left when the Japanese got through. They really did make a mess of everywhere they hit. They just practically destroyed everything. The only major force we had left in the Far East was the Asiatic Fleet. They had a home base called Cavite in Manila Bay, and as quick as the alert went out that night, they just took all the sailors that were present, the ones that were in town, they just left them. They didn't even wait for anybody. They just pulled up anchor, and all the Asiatic Fleet, a flotilla of destroyers and cruisers and 2 flotillas of submarines, slipped out of Manila Bay and never even got hit. They didn't have enough ships or power to engage the Japanese fleet at the time, so they headed south down into what is called the Makassar Straits between Borneo and the Celebes. Along these coastlines, there are little bays in there, and down in the tropics, everything grows so fast and that they just pull back in these little harbors, and they waited down in here for possibly a month, before they even made a move. And then when the Japanese got down in this area down here, they had one cruiser, the Boise. It was the fastest cruiser we had in the fleet. The Boise would set out and go out into the ocean, and they'd make contact with part of the Japanese fleet, and then they'd turn and they'd run back, and the Japanese fleet would start chasing them, and they'd come through the Makassar Straits, and all of our destroyers and submarines and that were on both sides of these islands, and as the Boise would draw these Japanese ships through, as soon as they get into the straits, our ships would open up, and they were sinking these Japanese boats so fast that they couldn't even send out a radio message to let the other Japanese know what was happening. And every day they were operating in this manner, sinking Japanese boats, trying to catch the Boise. Well, the Japanese kept moving on in all these areas here. And in the Philippines there, they landed 250,000 men in Lingayen Gulf that first day. and they started heading south. Now, we had to operate our airplanes at the same time, and we tried flying out of Nichols Field, but every day, 3 or 4 times a day, Japanese airplanes would come in and bomb us straight. So we took all of our equipment and we went north up by the city of San Fernando in a great big cane fields, and they were harvesting sugar cane. We just landed our fighter airplanes right where they were harvesting the sugar cane, and as soon as they'd land, we'd take and cover them up with this fresh cut sugar cane, and it just looked like a haystack. And the Japanese, they fly around looking for these airplanes all the time, but they never were able to detect them. And we operated out of there. We'd start about, maybe 3 o'clock in the morning, and we'd send our airplanes off. They'd fly off and they'd make a strike on these troops that had landed at Lingayen. Then they'd come back just as it was starting to get light in the morning, and we'd take and get them hit. We operated this way for, I guess about 2 weeks. Now, during all this time, after the first day, we were without food. They didn't have any. The only way we had something to eat, we had to beg, borrow, or steal in order to get something to eat. Now, in the tropics, there are lots of natural foods you could find. Fruits, roots, and like that. But this area down in there was a farm area, and they had a lot of these great big old water buffaloes. We'd go out at night time. If we found one anywhere that wasn't attended to, we'd just take and throw a rope around its horns. And sometimes we'd go out 10, 15 miles, and we'd bring that water buffalo clear back to our camp and butcher it in order to have meat. We fought this way right up till the 23rd of December, just a couple days before Christmas. And at that time, the Japanese had moved all the way clear down through San Fernando, and as their tanks and their troops were coming through the cane fields, we sent all of our airplanes off, and all the rest of the men and that jumped on the trucks and got on one road headed down towards Bataan. The airplanes flew down there and lit on the sandy beaches, and when the rest of the troops got there, we took the airplanes and we towed them back in a little area. There was one area there, must have been 20, 30 acres of rice paddies where they had raised rice. We had to work and chop out these dikes, which were about 4 feet high. We had to cut out all these dikes and that to make the runway for these airplanes to take off and land. And we worked round the clock for weeks in that, getting that airfield fixed. And we could pull our airplanes way back into the jungle in the thick trees, and that we could have them completely hid to where the Japanese couldn't find them. By this time we were down to 7 airplanes because they'd taken airplanes from us to give to the other fighter squadrons that had lost all theirs. We got down onto Bataan down there, and we were really hungry by this time. We had to start sending men out into the jungle to find food, and that for 250 men that was fighting a war. And about every 2 weeks you'd get this food detail, and you had to go out in these thick jungles. Of course, you could find everything out there, from wild chickens to pigs, wild pigs, the big iguana lizards. There was alligators and anything, monkeys. There were really a lot in the area, but when all these Americans got out there, this food didn't last very long. It got towards just before the surrender to where one little monkey had come screaming through the jungle, and there'd be 200 or 300 hungry, starving Americans trying to catch that one little monkey to make a meal out of it. That's how bad it was. And this was only just a short time after the war started. Now, Christmas morning, the day before Christmas, we went down to Marvelis and borrowed a boat off of the Navy and went over to Corregidor to see if we could get some food from the Army. They had plenty of food over on Corregidor, enough to feed the whole Philippine Islands for a couple of years. But they were kind of stingy and didn't want to get rid of any of it anyhow. Well, the day before they had a dive bombing attack on Corregidor, and up on the top side they had a big cavalry unit. They had these great big mules and beautiful horses and that. Many of them had got killed in the air raid. Some of them had been wounded and they had to shoot them. And they just took and butchered all these animals. And when our boat came back, we had the hind quarter of a mule and 15 pounds of rice for Christmas dinner, 1941. Just less than 3 weeks after the war broke out. Well, we kept on fighting out of our little air base there, and we'd take off early in the morning, you know, with a full load of bombs, machine gun bullets. We'd head out and hit the Japanese. And then one day, there were so many airplanes coming in, the Japanese had moved all their forces and that from a lot of these other areas into the Philippines. And they took over Nichols Field, and they made that their fighter base, and they must have had, like 1,200, 1,500 fighter planes on that base. And up at Clark Field, they put all their big bombers that were flying from the north on there. So one morning early, we rolled our 7 P-40s out, and we'd taken the external belly tank, which usually carried gasoline, off of these airplanes, and we'd made bomb shackles to put a 500-pound bomb on each airplane, in addition to 28 little 14-pound bombs, fragmentation bombs they carried under the wings. And then they had 650 caliber machine guns, and we loaded these with 5 rounds of tracer and 1 armor piercing, so that when they'd shoot something and hit it, it'd set it on fire immediately. Well, we took 4 of these airplanes, and they were supposed to go to Clark Field, and the other 3 was supposed to hit Nichols Field. Now, these airplanes were really heavily loaded, and they started down this short runway, and they'd run until the wheels would hit the water in Manila Bay, and then they'd start to climb out, and they'd fly out over Corregidor, and they'd circle around until they get their altitude, and then they'd head out. The first 3 airplanes, they got over Manila, and they circled around, used no radio or contact anything after they'd taken off, so the Japanese wouldn't be alerted to what we were trying to do. But these 3 airplanes, they circled around, and when they got down lower, they went over around Nichols Field. They let down their wheels and their flaps, just like they were coming into land, turned on their landing lights, and the Japanese turned on all the field lights. They must have thought they were their airplanes. Well, as quick as they went over the boundary, here's all these fighter planes, just acres of them, you know, lined up for half a mile long. And these 3 P-40s made one pass, and they just wiped out all the Japanese fighter planes. And it's the same instant at Clark Field, these other 4 done the same thing at Clark Field, and the Japanese turned on the lights, and these little fighter planes went down and destroyed all their bombers. Now, after that, we didn't see any airplanes for quite a while, but their ground troops and their Navy was moving all the time. The Polar Navy out here off the entrance to Manila Harbor, Bataan was just a small peninsula, maybe 38 miles long and about 14 miles wide. And all it was just a great big mountain, you know, just about like Loafer, you know, that just went right down into the ocean. And there was one road around the coast, all the way around, and the area along the coast, most of it was big cliffs, 200 and 300 feet high. We put a line across Bataan with all of our infantry and artillery and all that, and they pretty well kept the Japanese back. Then, one day it got kind of quiet, and we found out the Japanese had contacted cholera in their troops up in the north and almost wiped them out. So there was about a month there wasn't any fighting at all in the Philippines. But during this time, this army that went over into the area over here, General Yamashita, went into Indochina. They had moved all the way down this peninsula here, and they took Singapore. Now, they took Singapore, and they immediately loaded up all their troops and equipment, and they brought all of them clear back to Manila just to take this island of Luzon. They had us completely encircled. We couldn't have done anything. We were without food or medicine. And most of the Americans were all sick. This was the first mistake the Japanese made. Had they taken these 250,000 men and moved on down here to Australia, they'd have been down there before the Americans ever got there. Now, this area outlined in green, they were down here in less than a month after the war started. But they brought their major force up here to take the Philippines, which gave the Americans enough time and that to get equipment and that from the United States across the ocean down here into Australia, and they built big air bases with their big long-range bombers here at Darwin, and they operated out of there, and they were able to stop the Japanese when they pushed towards Australia. Now, this was only possible because the Philippines was the only area in this whole area of green here that wasn't controlled by the Japanese. And with them bringing 250,000 troops back up here, they lost the opportunity of taking Australia. The fighting really got hard after these troops got up there. And they brought in more airplanes, and they brought in more of these big ships. They had big cruisers, battleships off here, you know, that just lay off and shell you all day long. Well, our forces were getting weaker all the time, and finally the Japanese broke through our lines across Bataan. And here come 250,000 Japanese soldiers surging down over Bataan. And we really didn't have hardly much to fight with anymore. All we had to do was rifles and knives or bayonets. And that's about all we had to fight with. So on the 9th of April of 1942, they landed the night before the 9th. They had landed troops on Corregidor, which was the strongest fortress in the world. And they'd landed troops on there. And at the time, the Americans thought that the Japanese had a lot of troops on there. If they had withheld, they'd have found out that there were less than 300 Japanese had made it. But during this time, when they was hitting Corregidor, now Corregidor was just bristling like a porcupine with great big cannons. Everything from 16 inches down to anti-aircraft gun. And when we surrendered over on Bataan, Corregidor refused to surrender. And they could have held out for a long time. But Bataan had to surrender because the Japanese had us overrun. So they gathered us all down at Marvelis there, at this little airstrip we'd made. They gathered all the Americans there, and the first thing they done, they lined us up, and they took away all of our possessions. If you had glasses, watches, cameras, anything they wanted, they took. If you resisted or anything, you were dead. They took all these Americans and they lined them up into groups of 100 men, and they put them on this road headed north out of Bataan, and they started marching. As they put 10 or 15 Japanese soldiers with submachine guns and that behind us, and they started us and they run us for about 5 miles, and then they turn us around and run us back the other way. And then Corregidor, sitting over in the middle bay, the bay here, a mile and a half away, they seen all these Japanese troops had come down this road, and they had brought their big artillery, and they were setting them up on our airfield there to start shelling Corregidor. And as soon as they got the guns set up and the ammunition all ready to go, Corregidor opened up over on Bataan with everything they had. Gee, you could see them big shells coming a mile and a half. You'd see the flash of the big guns, and it just seemed like almost immediately them big shells were right there. And some of them shells looked like 50-gallon drums flying through the air. And when they'd go off, they'd make a hole about the size of a football field, and they'd just about clear a football field full of jungle. Every one of them big shells that was hitting there. And they were coming over by the thousands. And all we could do at the time was just drop and lay on the road, you know, right out in the open, just lay in the dirt there during all this yelling. But it all got over with, and I don't think there was an American even had a scratch on him. But they just completely annihilated all this big heavy artillery and that the Japanese had there. Well, the Japs got us up again, and they started us down the road. It wasn't a march, it was more of a double time or just a slow run all the time. Well, they kept us going. We went for 3 days and 3 nights. There was no food, no water. All along the road, there were big flowing wells, and these American prisoners and that, they'd just lose their mind when they seen water, and they'd just break for that water, and it was instant death right there. If you stumbled or you fell or you stepped out of line, you were bayoneted or shot immediately. And around each one of these wells, the bodies were just so high. And all along the road, the Japanese were coming down the road as we were going up. And the first group we encountered was a group of 500 cavalrymen on horses. And they stampeded their horses right over the top of us. And they just tried to trample us all to death. And that's what they were trying to do, was just kill off all the Americans during this Bataan Death March, of which they did. They done a real good job. Because there was over 15,000 Americans that were brutally murdered within that 3 days. And this march that we went on, took 175 miles in 3 days and 3 nights, with no rest. And it was brutal, real brutal. And when these horses were stampeding us, I was raised on a farm. I knew all about horses. I used to work up the racetrack over in Basin when I was a kid, and found out by using your thumb, you know, and jabbing these horses in the flanks, you know, as they come in on you, they'd rear up and they'd throw the Japanese, and we had Japanese getting trampled to death right along with the other guys. But, you know, just jabbing them in the flanks. And that's the only probably the only reason why I got out of that. I didn't even get smashed because I had two good thumbs and really kept working on them horses. But we went on and we came upon the tanks. Now these tanks, they just plowed right through us, run over the guys. If you couldn't get out of the road, you got run over. And it got so that this road was going on, it was just covered with American bodies, just smashed, and oh, it was a mess. And then on top of that, all the ammunition storage areas, the night we surrendered, they set all of them on fire, and these ammo storage units going up, they threw bombs and artillery shells and grenades all over the road, and you just had to step along. You might just bump one of them and it'd go off. We had quite a few miles of this to go through. And then we got down in the lowlands, and oh, it was so hot. Over there in the spring, that's the middle of the summertime, and it was so hot. It must have been 120 degrees in the shade. And they just kept us going. Had no hats or anything to protect our head from the sun. We just stopped right there. On this death march, we're just about at the halfway point. We just reached down in the lowlands out of the mountains. It was at least 120 degrees in the shade, and you couldn't find any shade anywhere. So it was brutal, and no water. We were dehydrating so fast, and that from perspiring in the heat, that we were getting to the point of exhaustion where people they'd just go unconscious, you know. And the minute they hit the road, the Japanese were right there with their bayonets, and that was the end of the bodies. Now, over there in the tropics, it can be perfectly clear skies, and in 10 minutes it can be pouring down rain. And another 10 minutes the skies would be clear again. But when it rains over there, it really rains. And this was fortunate for us, because this rain provided the only means of any moisture we could get. And here we are on this forced march, and when it had rained, the only way you could get any water was from the rain that was falling on your arms, by taking and licking your arms to get that rain. Now this march lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. We covered 175 miles from Marvelis clear up into the central part, about where this pink arrow is, at an old abandoned Philippine Army camp that had been abandoned back in 1935. Everything but one building had just deteriorated and all caved in. And they marched all of us into this area, and they'd put up barbed wire all the way around. Now in this camp we also had all these Filipino soldiers. There must have been 150,000 men in this one camp. We got into the area. There was no water in the area to drink. There was a river flowing through it, but the scum and that was 6 to 8 inches deep on this river, and if you drank any of the water, you were dead by the next morning. We found one little hydrant that, it'd maybe take you 5 minutes to, say, get a cup of water. And that was the only source of water we had, plus the rain. Now, we'd been in this prison camp for 2 or 3 days, and General Yamashita, who was a graduate of our West Point Military College, spoke perfect English, came into the camp, and they got all the prisoners in one group, and he made a talk to us. He told us we were now guests of the Emperor of Japan that we would not receive no food or no water until the island of Corregidor surrendered. This was the 12th of April of 1942, and Corregidor did not surrender until the 6th of May. 23 days we spent in this prison camp with absolutely nothing to eat. The only thing we could find to eat in the area, in the tropics, everything grows real fast. You take your shoes off and put it under your bed under normal times, and you get up the next morning, they're green with about an inch to an inch and a half of mold, you know, that grow on your shoes just overnight. Bamboo sprouts grow 2 feet overnight. The grass there was 8 feet tall, and there was plenty of grass. First thing that disappeared was all this grass. We were eating this grass like cattle. The trees in the area, all the leaves that went off the trees, the bark off the trees disappeared. And at nighttime when it rained, we'd all be out patting the ground, you know. You know these great big night crawlers we use for fishing here? We were trying to get them for something to eat. You'd hit one of them, you know, and you'd grab a hold of it with both hands and pull with all your might, because that might be the only thing you're going to get to eat for quite a while. There wasn't really too much left in the camp to eat. Now these old buildings that they had there, they were all thatched with this grass, had these grass roofs and sides, and they'd all caved in. I had a real bad case of cerebral malaria at the time, and I'd get these seizures where I'd get temperatures up to 106, 107 degrees, and I'd just go unconscious. And fortunate enough, I managed to always come out of them. But I felt one of these coming on, and the way you tell it, you feel like you're freezing to death. You just get so cold, you'd start shaking, and before long I'd be unconscious. Well, I crawled up under one of these piles of straw, you know, to go to sleep, where I'd be out of the intense heat from the sun, and I don't know how long I'd been under there. When I awoke, I looked, and there was a strange object laying right in front of my face, about that far. A head about as big as my hand like this, and 2 great big brown beady eyes just looking at me. And it registered, and I backed out from that straw screaming, "Snake, snake," you know. It was a snake all right. It was about that big around and must have been 20, 30 feet long. One of them great big pythons or boa constrictors. It could have, you know, just crawled up and swallowed me. But as I was screaming snake, all these hungry prisoners just converged on that spot, and they tore all that straw apart, and they caught that poor snake. And the last I seen of it, they had it held up shoulder height like this. There must have been 200-300 men, you know, hold of it, and they were eating that snake like they were eating a cob of corn. And when they got through, there was nothing left. Now anything that moved, and that had to move pretty fast, or it was food for these prisoners, because we were really getting down starved. We'd been starved for 4 months, and then we hit that prison camp and we had practically nothing at all. We were really getting in bad shape, just about like in them pictures there. When I went over there, I just got out of high school. I was in perfect shape. I weighed about 180 pounds. And that first month I was in prison camp, I figured I'd lost over 100 pounds. I was down to somewhere around 75, 80 pounds. And over the next 3 years, I got a lot smaller too. Well, we stayed in this prison camp there during the whole month of the rest of April and May, and during the night and the day when these people were dying, they were dying off just so fast. We lost, I guess, around 5,000 Americans and 60,000 Filipinos just in the period we were there. During the daytime, anybody that was able to even get up and walk had to go on a burial detail, and this is the only thing that went on in this first prison camp was burial detail. And it was out about 1.5 miles out from the camp, and as the people had died, they'd just take them out and lay them out on the dirt, and they'd lay out there all night or all day. There'd be acres of them every day. And everybody that was able to walk had to transport these bodies and that out to the burial site. Now these bodies in that heat, you take and lay one out there, and in 24 hours it was almost solid black, almost negroid in color. It just plain black. And many of them had started to deteriorate. We had no stretchers or nothing to carry them on. You had to pick these dead bodies up, throw them over your shoulder, and carry them over your shoulder for 1.5 miles out to the grave. Some of the bodies, and that were so small that they didn't weigh any more than maybe 40, 45 pounds. There was absolutely no flesh at all other than the skin left on the bones. You'll notice on that one picture, that fellow laying down, he weighed 45 pounds when that picture was taken. And that was the day we was liberated. 45 pounds, and he used to weigh 250. He was so weak that he couldn't stand up. He hadn't stood up for possibly, 6, 8 months before that picture was taken. When we transport these bodies out there, you get out there, and here you got one great big pit, maybe about 1/4 the size of this theater, and maybe 6 or 8 foot deep. And you just walk up to the edge, and you just throw the body right in the pit. Now you can imagine putting up to 1,000 bodies in one grave like that. After we got all the bodies in there, then we had to cover them up the best we could. Of course, it was almost impossible because sometimes the bodies were 20 feet higher than the depth of the grave. Then in the afternoon, we had to move over and we had to dig another grave for the ones that were dying in the next 24 hours. Well, we had grave after grave after grave, in a 1.5 months' time. And it got so terrible out there working out there in this grave area because they couldn't be completely covered, the bodies deteriorating, and the flies were so bad. You think we got flies over here, they got flies over there as big as my thumb, and they were so thick that when they'd come in out of the jungles, they just almost black out the sun. And they'd fly over there into the graveyards in the daytime, and then as it got dark, all these flies would leave and go back into the jungles. And the maggots got so bad that we'd go out there and we were working in maggots that was clear up to our knees. Of course, you didn't have to worry about eating because there wasn't anything to eat, so you couldn't turn your stomach any more than it was. And we had no medical supplies at all, none whatsoever. So if you got sick, it was just maybe you'd pull through it and maybe you wouldn't. If you was real bad, you didn't have a chance. In fact, anything that happened over there, you didn't have a chance. The span of your life was probably, you could figure 1 second. 1 second you could be alive, and the next second you could be dead. And the odds were very slim. After we were liberated 3.5 years later, there was only one out of over 100 of us that made it. Today, I guess they have less than 200 or 300 of us out of the original 38,000 men that are still alive. We have, I think, 42 men left in the state of Utah that were prisoners of war. most of them that went through the Bataan Death March. When Corregidor surrendered on the 6th of May, then a couple days later, the Japanese brought in truckloads of rice. Now this rice, I think must have been 20, 30 years old. It was just cull rice. It was moldy. It was wormy, but it was food. And the rice that we had to eat down there was terrible. Of course, when you're real hungry, you'll eat anything. You may not think it, but believe me, you get hungry like we were, you'd eat anything too. And when life gets that precious and that, you'll eat things you'd never believe. Now, after the Japanese started bringing this food in, well, all the prisoners were at such a condition that even after they got food there, you couldn't hardly eat. The stomachs were so shrunk up and and your whole body system was so out of kilter and that you couldn't eat. After 2 or 3 weeks of nothing to eat, you're no longer hungry. You have no hunger at all. So even good food wouldn't have helped us out too much, and it took a long time before we could, just eating a little bit, before we could get back to where we could even halfway eat a sandwich. After I got back from the war, it took me 5 years before I could eat a full meal. I still, after 35 years, 1 meal a day is all I eat. If I eat any more than that, I have troubles. Well, we woke up one morning and the Japanese gathered us all up, put us out on the road again, and started marching us. And we marched 85 miles to the northeast to another area called Cabanatuan, and there the buildings were much better. They were wooden 2-story barracks type buildings like we have in our military installations. The bottom level had no floor, it was the dirt. Upstairs they had a board floor, you know, every dirt and everything just fall through it. It was just a matter of staying a place to get out of the hot sun and the rain. And the extremes over there are so great that 1 second it'd be so dry and so hot, and 10 minutes later you're just flooded and cold. And these rapid changes were real hard on us. And we went into this Camp Cabanatuan. They had better water, good water to drink, and they had facilities, you know, for taking care of food a lot better than we'd had at Camp O'Donnell. And when we went in there, they had tables lined up, and as we went by, they had a sheet of paper that had a bunch of Japanese writing and that on there, and they had 10 lines with Japanese numbers, you know, written down the side. And we couldn't understand that. We didn't know what they were. You just sign your name on the next empty line, you know. And after we'd been in there for about 3 weeks, we found out what they were for. We had one of the Americans lost his marbles, or lost his mind, and he'd got through the barbed wire barricade and escaped. And a couple days later, they'd caught him off about 5 miles away, and the first thing they done, they just immediately hold him by the scalp and remove his head from his body. You just take one of them Japanese swords and zip, and off went his head. They took and put his body up on the stake bed truck, and they had a post mounted up in the middle, and they put his head up on top of it. And they brought him back into prison camp, and they drove that truck up and down the prison camp all day long to let us know what would happen to us if we tried to escape. Now we find out what this piece of paper was. We'd signed a piece of paper that said, if any person listed on this page escaped or attempted to escape, the remainder of 9 would be executed. So they get their papers out and they find this boy's name on, and then they gather up the other 9, and the next morning when the sun come up, they had these 9 boys right across the fence from the prison camp. They had all the prisoners moved right up around there, and here come the firing squad, and they executed them 9 other guys that was unfortunate enough to have their names on them on that piece of paper. They just riddled them across the middle with a machine gun, and then we had to go out and finish digging the graves and bury the 9. And then shortly after that, we had 3 naval lieutenants that escaped. They caught them too. Instead of bringing them in on a flatbed truck, they took and tied their feet with barbed wire and hooked it on the back of this staked truck, and they drug these 3 Navy lieutenants in the prison camp up and down that camp all day long. They drug them 3 men. And finally, at nighttime, they pulled up in a compound there. Japanese officer come over there and pulled out his pistol and bam, 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 and shot all 3 of them right in the forehead and put them out of their misery. But then the next day we had to stand there and watch 27 Americans stand out there and get executed. So it was a futile attempt to even try to escape. There was no food on the outside to eat. There was no place to go, and the only place you could have lived was in the jungle, and you just couldn't have survived on your own. So it was useless to try to escape. So we had to take and watch everybody. Anybody even start towards that barbed wire, we had to tackle them. And a lot of them we had to actually take and tie them up in the prison camp to keep them from trying to escape and get a bunch more men executed. We had to keep them tied down all the time. They just completely lost their minds, and they just wandered off. At this same time, diseases like typhoid and diphtheria and that started hitting the troops, and we lost a lot of men in that camp. Well, by September of 1942, the Japanese come in, and everybody that was even able to get up and walk, they took us all, 1,500 men that could walk, and we walked from there clear to Manila, which was another 165 miles. Everywhere we went, we walked. We lost a lot of men on every march we made. We got to Manila, and they put us in the old Bilibid penal prison there, and we stayed in there for, I guess 8 or 10 days. And about that time, one of the big cold storage units that hadn't been destroyed during the war went out of commission, and they had it filled with mutton. And during that 2 weeks, I think we got enough mutton to last us for a lifetime. But during the night, they came in and they routed us all out, and we marched down to the docks and onto a small Japanese freighter. I guess it couldn't have been any more than 75, 80 feet wide and about 500 feet long. Had a big, long, open hull, and the pilot house sit up on the back end of the ship. And they put the 1,500 of us in this boat, and then they sealed off the top of it with great big planks and canvases. We pushed away from the docks, and they started the motors, and we started out of Manila Bay early in the morning, and we just got outside of Manila Bay, and all at once there were some great big explosions. There was 24 ships in this convoy that we were in that was going back to Japan. And the American submarines had finally started working out of this area down in here and got back up in there, and this was the first raid that they'd started on Japanese shipping, and they hit our convoy. One large, great big tanker with aviation fuel. They hit that, and this gasoline spread out on the water, and it burned the paint off of just about all the boats that didn't get sunk. They had to really turn them motors on and get out of that fire, you know, that was on the water, or be burned up. But we continued on up the west side of Luzon, and we got right up here by the old American Navy base at Subic Bay. The torpedo hit in again, got a couple more ships. We went on, got up north. There's a string of islands right here above Luzon called the Bataan Islands. And the submarines hit us again, so they turned the convoy over, and we went right straight into Hong Kong harbor during the nighttime and dropped anchor. Now, the day that we surrendered, we still had 4 P-40 airplanes left. We'd completely taken all the armament, all the armor plate, the radios, and everything off of these airplanes. And we'd put the belly tank back on them, and these airplanes only carried 1 pilot. We took 5 pilots and crammed into each one of them airplanes. One of them took off and went south, got over the island of Cebu, and had engine trouble and had to land on a Japanese airfield, and they were all immediately beheaded, all 5 of our pilots. The other 3 P-40s took off and they flew to China. All 3 of them made it. All the pilots joined the Flying Tigers, and now here we're sitting in Hong Kong harbor, and at daylight the next morning, here come the Flying Tigers. And the first thing we could hear machine guns and bombs falling. We were down the hold of the ship, but that was the American Flying Tigers. They were coming in trying to sink us. They pulled up anchor. We went up the Chinese coast, just straight east of Taiwan, and started across. There's a group of islands there called the Pescadores. Now these islands, they just come right straight up out of the ocean, solid rock. The Japanese had went in and tunneled in underneath these mountains, and they built their submarine bases back under these rocks and that. And we laid in the harbor there for, I guess 14 days in that boat, while the Japanese Air Force tried to find these American submarines. They couldn't find them, so we finally left the Pescadores right here and went up this area here, and we got over west of Okinawa, and the submarines hit us again. The next day we were going along, I guess the waves were 3-4 feet high. The only restroom they had on that boat, they had 1 set of stairs, and they had the restroom, it just built out over the side of the ship and canvas around it. And I was so sick. And I was up there in the restroom, and all at once I happened to look through a tear in the canvas out there, and here's a great big white wave, coming on the water. The torpedoes they had back in them days were hydrogen fired, and the exhaust from this hydrogen burning in the torpedo had come up like soap bubbles on the water. And here that thing was zeroed right in on us. And I stood up there and I watched that thing just cutting a big arc coming right into us. And it just seemed like at the last, that torpedo couldn't have been 200 yards out from us. that ship, it just seemed like it just almost lifted out of the water and it went right straight for that torpedo. That torpedo went the full length of that ship, and it come right straight under me. A great big old silver torpedo, you know, about that big around, and you could see the black letters, you know, printed on it. And they'd only travel about maybe 20, 25 miles an hour, but that thing zipped the full length of that ship and just barely missed it. And then the Japanese started dropping depth charges, and I think they got one more ship there. They continued on. We went up the west side of the island of Kyushu, and right up here between Kyushu and Honshu, right in this inlet right here, there's a little island called Moji. We landed on Moji, and then we went by ferry across to Honshu, and this was during the night time, and it was November of 1942. We'd left the 7th of September. A trip that normally take 5 days from here to here took us over 2 months of all this traveling here. During this period, we lost 235 Americans. When they die, and now you just pass them along, you know, up the stairway, and they just take them up and throw them over, the bodies overboard. Now, for water on this ship, you maybe got a cup of water every 1 or 2 days, and for food, they'd cook this rice till it was almost like starch, and then they'd make rice balls just like a tennis ball, and you get one of them a day, and that's all we had. Now, these bodies that had died were taken up to throw overboard. Some of them were very badly eaten. All along the area, any flesh on the cheeks, and on the back of the arms, and the backs, and the buttocks, and that, it looked like animals had laid there and chewed on it. These animals were the prisoners of war in that boat. A bunch of cannibals down there in the dark, you know, 24 hours a day for that long of a time, in almost 2 months, with a bunch of cannibals. Well, we pulled into this island, you know, and they took the planks off of this ship. They said, "There's Japan." At that instant, there was a big explosion off the front of our boat, and then another one, and another one, and we looked out there, and here was a submarine out there about 5,000 yards, you know. They'd followed us for 2 months. They'd run out of torpedoes. There was only 4 boats left. Each one of these 4 boats had prisoners of war on them. There was no boat sunk that had any prisoners of war on them. But that submarine had come up within 5 miles of the coast of Japan and tried to sink them last 4 boats. He finally submerged, and that's the last we heard of it. It was November again, and the climate over there is just like it is here. It gets real cold and snowy. And we marched off of that ship onto Honshu, and 10 inches of ice and snow. We had on these little tropical shorts, short-sleeve shirts. Half the men didn't even have shoes on. And we had to march about 10 miles after getting off of that boat down these cobblestone streets and come to a freight yard, and they put us in these little tiny Japanese box cars. They're only about maybe a third the size of ours. And they crammed us in these so tight, just like sardines. And we rode just about all night long in these box cars. And we were going up the east coast here, and at each big town we'd come to, the train would stop, and they'd take off, open the door on one box car, and they'd take off the prisoners, and they'd remain in that city. You know, they'd make a prisoner of war camp. And we came to Kobe, and then Osaka, and at Osaka they took the car that I was in, they took us off, and there was 404 of us in that little car. And I don't imagine there was any longer in this center section, maybe as wide as, maybe 4 seats. There were 404 of us in that boxcar. But they took us off, and we marched just almost a whole night down to a great big steel mill along the edge of the China Sea. And they put us in there. We was up on the 3rd story of a building. Now the food in Japan was much better. There was plenty of food to start with, but we just, couldn't eat it after that 2 months on the boat. And we were all so sick. And the only thing that was in our favor was that climate change from that hot tropical heat to the cold winter. We started immediately, feeling better. We started eating a little more, started to regain our strength. And the Japanese put us out to work in a steel mill. We worked from daylight till dark, 7 days a week for a long, long time. We had no calendars. We had no news. We didn't know anything that was going on. We couldn't speak Japanese, so we were just by ourselves. We did start to improve quite a bit. We didn't know how the war was going on, but after we'd been there for a while, it got so that every once in a while the soldiers would come out. They'd take us out in the morning, turn us over to civilians. We'd work all day long. They'd come out and get us, bring us back and put us in a prison camp. During the daytime, the Japanese soldiers would come out there, and they were real rough and mean. Oh boy, I'll tell you, you don't know what sadist people are until you meet them people, and they've been that way for 5,000 years. And they'd come out, and boy, they'd really rough us up, and they'd take us back into the prison camp, put us in a compound, maybe as big as this theater. We'd have to stand out there in the wintertime, with practically no clothes on at all, stand out there at attention all night long in freezing weather. They'd get us down into positions, like you were doing push-ups, on your fingertips and your toes, and get you up in that position there. And you might have to stay that way for 2-3 hours. If you'd collapse, then they were over there with hardwood clubs, like axe handles, trying to beat you to death. And we went through this quite a few times, and we thought, gee, there must be some reason why these people are doing it. They were taking revenge on us. Every time the Americans win a battle anywhere, we'd get repercussions from it there in the prison camp. So it got to the point, so every time they'd pull us in and do this to us, they'd say, gee, Uncle Sam must have taken another island, and we started, feeling kind of good about it, because we knew something was happening. Then, gee, we worked for almost 2.5 years in this steel mill. Food wasn't a large amount. Your ration a day was 200 grams of rice a day. Now there's 453 grams to a pound of rice. So 200 pounds is a little bit less than a half a pound. And that is just exactly enough rice when it's cooked to take 3 coffee cups and make 3 meals a day, breakfast, noon, and supper. And that was our main diet for the 3 years we were in Japan, and we were working all the time on this. Every once in a while we might get, maybe 3 or 4 dried fish, or some of these big pickled turnips they have over there. And when we first went there, we had to go out and clear off about a 40-acre field, gather up all the rocks, and we planted sweet potatoes. When the sweet potatoes came on, the Japanese took all the sweet potatoes and we got the vines. And they'd just take the vines and they'd put them in a great big pot and boil them down, and we'd get the broth off of the sweet potato tops. working like we were, you know, there was areas in this steel mill, places where we worked, there were older Japanese. Many of them had served in the merchant marine and had been to the United States, you know. And they could tell you all about Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and San Pedro and Los Angeles and that. And we started learning a little bit more of the language, you know, where we could communicate with these people. And as the war went along, they were withdrawing the men and that from the Japanese workforce until they were down. They had boys up to 12 years old, and men that was from 65 and older was all that was left. They'd taken all the younger men into the armed forces, and they'd all been killed. And it got to the point, this big steel mill we were in, we knew more about it than Japanese did, and we just almost running a steel mill. Of course, these people weren't too intelligent when it comes to thinking for themselves. They can do one thing and do it better than anybody, but they do one thing all their life. They never do anything else. They don't get a chance to think, and we could just outwit them all the time. Where we'd been in Japan for quite a while, working in this big steel mill, manufacturing all kinds of war items and items for civilian use. The war had taken quite a toll on the Japanese people because they had withdrawn so many of the physically fit men and that from the industry that there was practically nobody left except young boys 12 years old and younger and men 65 years and older. And we'd been working there such a time in the prison camp to where we knew more about running the steel mill than the Japanese did. They didn't have a high grade of people left there that were intelligent enough to take and run it. So in a lot of the phases, we were actually keeping the steel mill going. But being true Americans, you know, we just couldn't keep on producing things to go against our troops. So this little old thing called sabotage, it went along all the time we were there was a certain amount of it. You know, you can only go to a certain point. We had machine shops where they have these carborundum wheels, you know, for grinding. We had a crew working in there, and every night when they'd clean up, they'd take all this carborundum dust, you know, underneath the wheels, and they'd smuggle it into the prison camp. Then they turn it over to the crew that was working, oiling all the gearboxes and all the machinery and that in the steel mill. And they'd take this carborundum and they'd put it in the oil cans, you know, and shake it up, and they'd oil everything. Before long, you know, all the bearings were shot on all the machinery, and it got so they was spending more time trying to keep the steel mill operating than they were putting out anything. These big blast furnaces, we'd have to get in there and, you know, after they'd run for a while, we'd tear all this fire brick out and we'd re-brick it up. The Japanese would leave to go eat their lunch, you know, and we'd have to just keep working while we'd just maybe you'd have about that much of that big fire brick, you know, lining the inside of one of these big furnaces, and you take and start out and you miss one brick, you know, and then you get on the inside and you put just one thin brick in there, and they fire the furnace up and they get it all filled up with coal and coke and everything, and it all gets melted, and it doesn't take very long to burn through that one brick on the front, see, and all that hot steel goes right through to the steel, and it just turn red immediately and melt, and you'd have 40 or 50 ton of molten steel just pouring out on this wet sand. It just exploding like bombs and fire all over the place, and by the time it was all through, that furnace was completely disabled for possibly 2 and 3 months. And we done things like this all the time. Times when we didn't destroy the furnace, you know, it takes a certain mixture of the components that go into making steel to produce a certain type of steel. And the more you heat this steel, and that, it becomes carbon steel, and it becomes so brittle it's just like ice. You can just hit it with a hammer and it'll go ping and it'll crack. Even steel that thick. Well, they had to use a certain percentage of this. And when the Japanese would leave, we just take and throw in a bunch of this high carbon steel into the furnace, and nobody ever knew it. They'd spend 2 weeks, you know, out there in the molds and that, getting all these molds and that, and then they'd pour it, and they'd pull it all out of the sand, you know, and the inspectors would come along, and they had a steel rod, maybe about a 1/4 inch in diameter. They'd pick up a piece and they'd hit it like that, and it'd just go ping, and it'd snap. Everything would break, you know. So they'd have to melt it all down again, redo the whole works, and then start over again. So the output of this steel mill surely wasn't helping the Japanese any. Now, about the end of 3 years when we'd been in Japan, the Japanese started building up anti-aircraft positions and that all around the place. And we knew that the Americans just had to be getting closer. We wasn't sure. We hadn't seen any airplanes or anything like this to verify it. But then one night in August of 1944, in the middle of the night, all the air raid sirens went off, and here we're up on a 3rd-story building with all glass windows all the way around. We could see everywhere, you know. And we seen all these searchlights way down in the Kobe area, all come on, and all just like fingers, you know, reaching up in the sky. And pretty soon we could see these silver things that glitter, and they kept coming right straight towards us. And they got just about to us, and there was 70 of these great big B-29 4-engine bombers that they'd flown all the way clear from Burma right here to bomb right up here. Now, this distance right here, you imagine, now this distance from, say, from right here to right here is almost 1,800 miles. So you can see them airplanes flew 2,300 miles to bomb Japan. Well, when this happened, we knew that the Americans were close to Japan. And the raids started coming in more often and more often. Maybe they'd be 2-3 weeks apart. They never did have any bigger flights than 70. And maybe they'd come in with 20, 25 at one time. They'd bomb a whole area. Each airplane carried 30 tons of bombs. They used small bombs, lots of fire bombs, because everything over there was just like matchboxes, and these thermite bombs they carried, they come in bundles as big as a 50-gallon drum. After it dropped from the airplane, it automatically opened, and these little thermite bombs, about this long and maybe about that big around, as soon as the chemical came out of them and the oxygen, all it had to do was just get to the right point, just like phosphorus. You know, you take phosphorus out of the liquid, and as soon as it dries out, and the oxygen will ignite it by itself. And they work like this. Well, each one of these bombs carried about 500 of these little ones. And when they'd come apart, it was just like a box of stick matches, you know, just spreading them out. And they'd fall apart and they'd just come fluttering down, and about halfway down they'd ignite, and anything they hit, it burned down. There's no way of putting it out. You dump water on it, they just explode, and you got fire all over the place. The only thing you could do when they'd land in our area, we'd take a bucket of sand and just cover them over, and they'd burn out. Then you'd just have a great big gob of glass there after it was all burned out. But they'd pretty well destroy a city, in one flight. But in 2 weeks' time, everything was built back up again. Them Japanese, the workingest people you ever seen in your life. They just outdo any other race when it comes to work, bar none. And they'd build these cities back like they'd never even been hit before. So then the Americans had to change their system of bombing. Instead of these mass flights coming clear out of here, they'd retaken Guam and Tinian and Saipan here, and they'd put about 3,000 of these big bombers on there. So they started one airplane, another airplane a minute later, another airplane. They flew 1 minute behind each other, and they just had a steady string going and coming. And it got to where some of these raids, they'd go on and last for 2 solid weeks. An airplane would come over and take a certain area and drop 30 ton, and it's boom, boom, boom. And these 30 tons of bombs that drop on Japan shakes the whole island. You can feel it no matter where they're bombing, anywhere on that island. Every minute of these bombs going off, it made it so nobody got any sleep. And they finally had the Japanese so beat down, they were so tired that they could be standing working and go to sleep. They were that tired, and we were the same way. Now, when the airplanes first started coming in that way, one at a time, they used to have another same B-29s called Pathfinders. They come on the hour, every hour, 24 hours a day. They didn't carry any bombs. They carried big cameras and weather equipment, and they flew every hour so they could have the weather reports and all that kind of conditions. Now, being in the Air Force, we knew that every airplane they had carried cameras, and these big B-29s had cameras that were so big they'd open them Bellum Bay doors, and you could see the lens on them cameras up about 30,000 feet. Now these airplanes started coming in. There wasn't very many Japanese planes left to even intercept them. I think we had one Pathfinder come over one day, and there were 6 Japanese fighters took off to intercept it. And the first pass they made on it, the B-29 shot down 2 of them. And they made another pass, and they shot down 2 more, and the last 2 Japanese planes just left. And that was the only Japanese planes we see even try to encounter these bombers. Well, in a big steel mill, it takes a lot of coal. All this coal was brought in on boats and big barges, and us prisoners had to unload it. Well, whenever the air raid sirens would go off, the Japanese would leave and go into the air raid shelters, and we had to stay right where we were. And here we are out here unloading coal, and all we had on was just a pair of little shorts, and white skin, and the Japanese all leave. All these Americans would get on top of this great big coal pile, and we'd start forming letters like PW, USA, and we even got so we'd write messages. Maybe we'd only get to write maybe one word or something at a time. But after the war, when the Americans took us over in Tokyo, the Air Force was right there, and they showed us these pictures. They had all of them. They knew right where our prison camp was. They knew there was so many of us there, and everything about it. So our prison camp didn't even get touched. We sit right there, and they never even touched the steel mill. But everything else for miles around had just been flattened, just as flat as this floor right here. And we just sit up there and watch these raids go on day after day after day. They shot down a few of them, you know, with anti-aircraft, and but it was a real small amount. Their anti-aircraft wasn't too good, so they started dropping down to about 5,000 feet to do their bombing, and then they were real close when they had come in. One night, we had one B-29 come in. It was a lone one, and it flew right over the prison camp at about 5,000 feet, and it went up north, and it turned around, and it come right back straight in towards this row of buildings where we were living in on this steel mill, and he's coming right straight into us, and he had all these searchlights right on him. He was just shining like a diamond, you know, with all the light on him. And all at once, them two big bomb bay doors pop open, you know, and even a mile away, you could hear them go boom, you know, when it opened them doors. And just about the instant where he would have had to drop these bombs to hit this row of buildings, anti-aircraft shell hit him and he blew up. Or he'd have probably taken the whole prison camp and everything. And that was the only airplane we saw that we was glad got shot down. Well, this kept going for a long time, and they were really tearing Japan up. Then one day, it was Christmas of 1944. Christmas Day. Just at daylight in the morning, all at once, boy, I'd never heard so many airplanes. Just like a nest of hornets, and they just come from all directions. There was thousands of airplanes. The 7th and 11th Fleet had pulled off of the coast of Japan right here, and they'd launched all their carrier planes. And they hit the Kobe, Osaka area. And all day long these airplanes were coming and going. Shooting rockets, machine guns, dropping bombs. And then later on that afternoon, just before it started to get dark, here come one little airplane, you know, in from the ocean, and he flew, come right over the prison camp, and he pulled up and started going right straight up, you know, a spiral like this, and he went up, 15,000 feet, and he leveled off, and then he wrote a great big USA in the sky, you know, with the smoke and that, you know, like they put in these airplanes for skywriting. But then, when he wrote that, then we knew that they'd got our pictures, you know, from the coal piles. Well, they started hitting us more and more with airplanes like this, and then one day, a flight of airplanes came in. They were land-based fighter planes, P-51. We knew they didn't come off carriers. And that's when they'd taken Iwo Jima here. And this flight of P-51s came in. This flight, up on their tails, they had painted the insignia. It was our group that had been destroyed in the Philippines. They had reorganized it, and it was the first fighter group to go into Japan from the line. Right shortly after this, they had Japan tore up so bad by May of 1945, we couldn't even get drinking water in a steel mill, and it was hard to find food, even for the Japanese. So they took the remainder of us, what was left. 404 of us went into that prison camp. Only 72 of us walked out. And that was all that was left alive. We left that prison camp and we walked across this bridge on this river and got up, maybe a mile towards the center of town. The air raid sirens went off, and they told us to get off the side of the road and lay down. In about 5 minutes, there was 25 great big B-29 bombers come in at about 5,000 feet from the south, and they come in and they completely, that steel mill we left less than an hour ago was wiped right off the map. They dropped bombs, 15,000-pound bombs that made craters that was 300 feet across. Monstrous bombs. In the rolling mills, these big rollers that was 12 and 14 feet in diameter were melted right to the ground. We went back after the war and went through that steel mill, and there was nothing left. Bodies and that of people that were killed during the raid, the remainders were still laying all around the steel mill. But we went out to the train station. They put us on a train, and they sent us right straight across from Osaka. We went through Kyoto here, where they have all these temples and shrines. None of that area had been touched. This is really beautiful country over there in Japan. It's mountainous, and oh, it was pretty, and they'd preserved all that. They hadn't bombed none of it. But they took us over here to the western side of Japan. There was a big port over there. The only port they had yet operating that hadn't even been touched. Well, we went over there, and we found out there was a prison camp over there. They had 2,600 prisoners. They were prisoners from Singapore and all this area down here, plus a bunch of Americans. And they thought the Japanese had won the war years ago. They hadn't seen an airplane or anything. They'd heard a lot of explosions, but they didn't know what they were. And it just seemed like when we went over there, they took the 72 of us, and they had us working in the shipyards, unloading all these ships that they were bringing all this loot from all these areas. The first ship we unloaded was 10,000 ton of Manchurian peanuts, 50-gallon drums of peanut oil. Oh man, I'll tell you, talk about eat. We eat from daylight till dark, and we really started getting back into good shape from the food that we was getting off of these boats. And gee, I'd got up to a great big fat 120 pounds, and I was probably at the strongest point of my life then. And that from the work I've been doing, the 3 years hard physical work, and doing nothing else but just working, that was all. But I was in pretty good physical shape then, and we had to work hard. We had plenty of food while we was working, but it just seemed like when we started to work over there, here come the American airplanes. They followed us right over there. Within a week after we'd been there, we was working in these ships, unloading them. We had a big salt ship, and they had these great big nets with canvas in, and we'd have to shovel the salt on the nets, and then they'd hoist them out and put them in a railroad car. And then the net had come back in. We're just sitting there, waiting for the net to be unloaded, and all at once, boom, boom, and 2 rockets went right over our heads, right through that salt ship. They went through one side and out the other side into the pier and exploded. And then one of these Grumman fighters come zoom right in, following over it. And before we know it, there was, I guess, 50 to 75 Navy torpedo bombers, dive bombers, rocket planes, and they sunk about 14 ships right there. They were just pulling in a great big transport, loaded with military troops, and they put a bomb right down the stack of that thing, and they sank that big boat with one bomb, and it'd just sit there and shudder, and then it'd sink. And it went clear to the bottom, and you could just barely see the railing around the side, just barely sticking above the water. And for hours along the side of that ship, they were opening portholes down below and escaping, and heads bobbing up, and Japanese soldiers swimming. And Oh, they really made a mess that harbor for a while. Most of the Japanese, whenever a raid was on, the Japanese would leave. Now, I came out of that salt ship up a ladder. There's about a dozen of us working down in there, and I think we all come up that little ladder at the same time. And we were really moving, and I run to the left and jumped, and I looked down, and I jumped over the side of the ship into the water. Of course, I never could swim, but I learned fast. The other guys had jumped onto the pier. Oh, these little planes coming down, the city was built up on the hillside like this, you know, just maybe a mountain, maybe 500-600 feet high. And the city was built from the bay right up this hillside. And all these ships in the bay all sitting in there. These American airplanes, they'd come over and they'd just barely skim over the top of this mountain. They'd put their wheels down and their flaps down so they could fly about 40 miles an hour, and they're just coming over the rooftops, see, like this. These ships out here couldn't shoot because then shells was going right into all them houses. And they'd come down, and they'd hit the water, and they'd suck their gear and flaps up, and by that time they'd be zeroed in on one of them Japanese boats, and they'd cut loose a torpedo or their rockets, and their dive bombers were working up above, and some of these little torpedo bombers, you know, they just skim above the water, and they'd come right along the end of the piers, you know, and us guys with white skins, you know, standing up there, you know, waving, and finally one of them, you know, recognized us, you know, and he swung around, he let his gear and his flaps down, and it just seemed like he was almost just glued right there in the air. He was flying so slow. And he'd roll back his canopy. He flew within 20 feet of us, and about 20 feet away, an American pilot, and he must have radioed all the rest of them, because they'd come in to make the run, they'd circle around, every one of them airplanes would circle right back and come right by and do the same thing. And we had one big B-29 come over, big photo Pathfinder come over, and we told the Japanese, we said, you better look out, they're going to be in here tomorrow and they're going to wipe this place right off the map. The next morning, normally they had 40,000 Japanese working on the docks there, and the next morning there wasn't a Japanese anywhere. They'd even evacuated the city. They got so they'd believe us. Well, the B-29s did come in. Then the next morning, as we were falling out for work, just as it was starting to get light just above the mountains, we seen this giant flash to the south of us. We didn't know what it was, but the next day we knew. Hiroshima's right here. We were just 85 miles straight north of Hiroshima, and it was the first atomic bomb. Now, that thing lit up the sky brighter than the sun does, and it'd get bright, and then it'd die down. It just pulsated. And each time the flame would bellow out, it'd get just that much brighter. We thought they'd hit a big ammunition dump or something, but it was the atomic bomb, and they'd wiped out Hiroshima. The Japanese were ready to quit right there. Boy, they just laid everything down and quit. Well, the Americans just kept going. They didn't let up. And a week later, they dropped one on Nagasaki down here. They missed Nagasaki and dropped it halfway up on the mountainside, but it still wiped out 3/4 of the town. And the Japs really quit then. Well, 2 or 3 days later, on the 14th of August, the American pilots had hit a great big Japanese cruiser with a torpedo, and rather than sink out in the bay, they just run it in between two big piers, you know, and it just settled a little bit, and It was resting on the bottom. And we went to work, and they gathered all the Japanese around this cruiser, you know, on these two piers, and they took us prisoners, and they took us way down about a half of a mile to the last pier down there, and they had about 15, 20 soldiers, you know, with machine guns guarding us. And it was right in the middle of the day, and they turned on the PA system that they had aboard this cruiser, you know, to talk to the Japanese. And the wind was blowing from the east, and we could hear everything that was being said. And it was the Emperor of Japan talking to the Japanese people and telling them the war was all over. And when he said "Sensawari," which means the war was over, we just grabbed all these soldiers we had, and we just took them over and threw them overboard into the ocean. Just threw them off the piers. And then we went down and we got into all these ships, into their cold storage units, where they had, you know, beef and meat and sugar and all kind of, you know, good food. We took all this good food. We took all the military trucks and that they were using there in the shipyards. We loaded all this food on these trucks. We had to drive 26 miles around the bay to the prison camp. When we went to work and come back and forth, we rode on a big tug across that bay every morning and every night. Every night, these big P-29s were coming in and dropping mines. They mined that harbor every night. And this tug, you know, was real shallow depth, and, you know, they'd watch, you know, for surface mines, and if they seen one, they'd just go out around it. But we rode across that bay morning and night over them mines. But this day, we took the trucks and went around. We took all this food over there to the prison camp. Now, while we was working on these ships, the food still wasn't too much or too good. Here we're working in all this rice and beans and peanuts and all this. You know, we learned ways of smuggling too. We got to be the world's best smugglers. They took, for shoes, they made some like rubber gym shoes, you know, G-katabis they call them. And I think they made one size 16, about like that. Everybody had the same size. Isn't it surprising? Gee, you could take that shoe off and fill it up with rice and put your foot in there, and when you got back to prison camp, you'd have 5 pounds of rice in each shoe. Of course, you know, you'd take little bags, you know, and you could put them under your belt. We wore a uniform just like the Japanese soldiers with wrapped leggings, and every night while we was waiting for the tug to come and get us, they'd have this rice and that all stacked up in these straw bags, about this high, all over the docks. And we'd take a piece of bamboo, you know, it's hollow, and we'd cut it off at an angle so it had a sharp point. You get a piece about that long, you know, and just have it inside your pants there, and you walk up to a stack of these Sawali bags filled with rice and that, and you shove that point, you know, you work it into the bottom of the bag, and you stand there, and all the rice runs down and fills up your pants. Clear from the wrapped leggings on, clear to the belt, you know, you put almost 50 kilos, that's 120 pounds, you know, in there, and the tug comes along, you step down, and then you go over, and they land, and you step off, and the tug leaves, and undo the leggings, you know, and stand on a blanket or something like that, or in a bag, you know, and for 72 guys, you know, boy, when we'd get through unloading, we'd have a truckload of rice or sugar or anything like this we'd take into the prison camp. And then one day, we had an air raid. What they do, the first thing they sank was our tug. We was at work, so we had to walk 26 miles, and you know, we was all loaded up and that waiting for the tug when we found out they'd sunk it. So they put us on the road and they started running us. You ought to try running 26 miles with your pants full of rice or soybeans. It'd just take it, every step you'd make, you know, it'd just jiggle down. Pretty soon your legs were this big around, you know, and you couldn't hardly move them. But fortunate enough, every once in a while these airplanes would come zooming in again. We'd hit the side of the road, and everybody, as soon as they'd hit the road, you'd see feet in the air kicking, you know, trying to kick the beans in our rice. And most of them, they finally had to just undo their leggings and let it out on the side of the road. They just couldn't go anymore. Well, the war was over, and the very next day, here come a big B-29 in, and he dropped a portable radio, and I was the only radio operator, so I got to work the radio. Come to find out, the radio operator on that big B-29, I went to radio operator school 4 years before back in Illinois, and he was a very good friend of mine. And what they wanted to know if we needed doctors, medicine, or anything like that. We had 2 or 3 doctors in there, but they didn't have any medicine or anything. So we told them we needed medical supplies, and they said they'd get everything in there right away. Well, this big B-29, he'd flown all the way clear from Guam. And these 2 big Bombays, they'd just built a big wooden platform, and they'd stacked 30 ton of cases of food on these 2 big platforms. And this big B-29, he says, clear off a space and mark it, and we'll drop you some. And we went out in this potato field, and we marked an area. We'd gathered up all these rocks, you know. We had a monstrous pile of rocks right there. And in come this great big B-29, and he must have been 5 feet off of the ground. Bombay doors open, and all at once he dropped both them big platforms at once. They only had to fall, you know, just about 5 feet. Well, when they dropped them, you know, the airplane just automatically lifts like that, and 30 ton being dropped like that. And here's these 2 great big pallets, almost the size of a school bus, with all this cases of food and all that on, and it hits the ground and it starts sliding. And where did it go? Right into that rock pile. But there was gallon cans of ketchup and mustard and green pea soup and anything they didn't use during the war, they sent it to us, and it was all smashed on that rock pile. And the pilot swung back around. He says, "We made a bad drop. We'll be back tomorrow." Next day they come in. Here were 15 of these great big B-29 in a V formation. They come over to about 1,000 feet, and they opened them Bombay doors and they cut loose. This time they had everything in 50-gallon drums, and they had a parachute on each drum. And these parachutes were red, white, and blue. And food was just coming down, ropes broke, and drums was cartwheeling, and some of the parachutes had a whole half a beef, you know, on them, fresh meat and all that. And in a matter of about 4 days, they put 600 ton of food into that prison camp. Some of the prisoners that had been starved for 4 years eat themselves to death in a couple of days. Guys that went through the whole thing and then just eat so much it killed them. Well, we sit there for about 2 weeks. They kept flying over you, wanting to know how we was and all that. Well, we were doing pretty good by then. And a bunch of us got tired of sitting there, so we went over and stopped the train on the railroad track, and 14 of us got on the train, and we come all down the west side, down to where we had landed 3.5 years before. And then we got on another train. We come up and we stopped at Hiroshima, where the atomic bomb had went off just 2 weeks before that. and seen that, and we went on up to Tokyo, and we stayed up in the Tokyo area for 3 or 4 days, and the Americans still didn't come in, so we went clear to the north of Honshu, and then went all the way back down to prison camp, and we were there a couple days, and the Americans had made a special train to fit these Japanese tracks, you know, with cars and everything, and they came in with this train and took us all out of the prison camp. And they took us back up to Tokyo, and they moved into the Tokyo area, and they had built 4 great big piers out into the water there, and they had 4 great big hospital ships. And they put us in these hospital ships, and we stayed there for a week and went through interrogation for a solid week, you know, on everything that happened during the prison camp. Everything, just down to the minute that happened, all went into this interrogation. Then these hospital ships left. We started, and we got 1 day out of Seattle, and they had a big typhoon going up, and they turned around, and they brought us all the way clear back down to Manila. They put us in a big hospital there in Manila for 30 days, and then we got on the military hospital boats, and they took us all the way down through the South Pacific, down through New Hebrides, and all the way over and up the coast of Mexico, and we finally landed in San Francisco about a month and a half later. But they'd put us on these boats, you know, to try and get us back in better shape, you know, when we got in the States. Because I'll tell you, you'd never seen such a sight in your life. You'd seen these pictures of these people in the concentration camps over in Europe. We didn't look any better. At one time, my arms, I'd lost so much weight that I could take my thumb and my finger and wrap around my wrist, and without opening them, I could go clear to my shoulder. And my legs are almost the same way. My knees were about this big, and you could actually see the bones. There was nothing but skin and bones. And that's the way we lived for about 3.5 years under conditions like that. Now, when we were liberated, and that, they told us there was 1 out of 100. Only 1 out of 100, you had 1% chance of living. And it was so hard on most of the men that most of them have all died since they come back. And here just recently, here about 2 months ago, they took a survey, and there's less than 300 of us left today. Well, this experience, no amount of money could pay me to do it again. But it was an experience that I did learn a lot there, and these experiences wouldn't be of no use to anybody if I didn't get up and talk about it. Now, it took me 15 years after I came back before I could stand up and talk about it. Lots of things, and that, you know, I just don't make any mention of it, because some of the things were so bad that it was just terrible. Like one time they stopped our group on a death march, and they lined us up. And a Japanese officer come along. He took every other man and just pushed them back. And they just took them right 15 feet off from the side of us and lined them up and shot them all. Things just like that, you know, it could happen that quick. And all the way through, it didn't get any better at any time. It was just plain bad all the time. It's just a miracle that any of us even lived through it. And I just hope that none of you people ever have to go through an experience like that. But if you do, if you ever do, if you got a strong enough mind to want to live, you can do it. That old body of yours will take a lot more than you ever realize it. And you have to have a strong faith. And when the war first broke out, I just had the feeling, something told me that I was going to make it back home. I was reported killed in action before Christmas of 1941 after Pearl Harbor. My unit was supposed to have been wiped out. My parents and my 8 brothers and sisters, none of them felt like that I'd been killed. They all felt that I was still living, and it was 3 years after I was captured that they found out I was still alive. So there was something that told me, and there was something that told them, and give us the confidence that everything was all right. It's strange to have a lot of things like this, like the torpedo missing a ship, a bomb falling within 5 feet of me that was a dud. Many things like that happened, and that spared my life. And it just wasn't by accident. Okay, well, it's good to get out and talk to you people, let you know about this, and let you know that just not you kids have had problems in your life. A lot of other people's had a lot worse than you'll ever have. And the way I look at it, anything that happens to me, I can always look around and I can always see other people that are having more hardships than I've had. And I've always been glad when they come around for cancer drive or anything like that. I say, boy, I'm sure glad I can give, that I'm not on the receiving end. It's better to give. You always feel better. Okay, thank you.